this issue, what I'll mention in a moment. That's the Arab League proposal. In that context, it calls for normalization of relations with Israel. But for Kerry and also for Obama, I'll come back to that, the only part of the proposal that exists is normalized relations with Israel. Well, what's happened in between? Well, for one thing, in 1971, the three no's were gone. Egypt offered a full peace treaty with Israel. Nothing for the Palestinians, in fact. Just withdrawal from the Sinai, Egyptian territory. Okay, if that had been accepted, Israel would have no security problems. The Palestinian issue hadn't even arisen in any way that anyone was paying attention to, at least. Egypt is the major military force in the Arab world. Full peace treaty would have ended the security problems. Israel understood this, but they rejected it. They rejected it in favor of expansion. At that time, it was expansion into the northeastern Sinai, where thousands of Bedouins were being forcefully expelled, driven into the desert. Israel was planning to build a major city, a city with 1 million people, a seaport, Yamit, and a lot of settlements, Juksim and others in the neighborhood from which the inhabitants were expelled. So they chose expansion into the Sinai over peace, over security. And in fact, that choice has governed Israeli policy from then until now. Security is interesting, but expansion is a much higher value. Well, the crucial question in 1971 was what the U.S. would do, as it always is. And there was an internal struggle in the government between the State Department, William Rogers, who wanted to continue with what had been U.S. policy, namely no acquisition of territory by force. That means a settlement on the pre-June 67 border, the international border, with minor and mutual modifications, meaning straighten out some curved lines from the ceasefire. He proposed to continue with that. Henry Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor, was at that time trying to take over the State Department, so he'd run the whole show. And my opinion is if Rogers had said it's raining, Kissinger would have said, no, the sun's shining. But in any event, since Rogers was in favor of this, Kissinger took the opposite position. His position was what he describes proudly in his memoirs as stalemate, meaning no negotiations, just force. He won out in the bureaucratic competition, and the United States backed Israel's rejection of peace in favor of expansion. And that's what's been the policy ever since, up until this minute. In 1976, the Arab states brought a resolution to the Security Council calling for a two-state settlement. By that time, the Palestinian issue had reached the international agenda, the two-state settlement on the 67 borders, the pre-67 borders, the international border. The U.S. reacted by vetoing it. A U.S. veto, worth bearing in mind, is a double veto. For one thing, it doesn't happen, and for another thing, it's wiped out of history. So try to find a reference for it anywhere, aside from the margins or a few specialists. Same thing happened in 1980, another resolution. Under Carter, also vetoed by the United States. And meanwhile, the issue shifted to the General Assembly, where similar resolutions were brought up almost annually. Standard votes were something like 150 to 2, or maybe 151 to 3, sometimes Dominica, Marshall Islands, or somebody would join in. But essentially blocked by the U.S. systematically every year. And it goes right up to the president. So let's take not just John Kerry, but President Obama. He has so far made one major foreign policy declaration, namely when he announced the appointment of his Middle East negotiator, George Mitchell. And his speech was interesting. He said, of course, our main concern in the region is the security of Israel. Everything else is secondary. But he said there are constructive moves coming from the Arab side for the first time. And he, like Kerry, mentioned the Arab League peace proposal. There's very constructive elements in it, calls for normalization of relations with Israel, and the Arab states should now proceed to implement that. And adding Kerry's conceptual reconstruction, reorganization, that means join us in this alliance against Iran, the real enemy. Now, Obama is an intelligent person, and he chooses his words carefully. He surely knew that that was not the Arab League proposal. It called for the two-state settlement that the U.S. alone has rejected for over 30 years. And in that context, normalization. So his omission of that is a clear signal that he intends the U.S. to continue with its rejectionist program. There have been very rare departures from this, if you go through them, but rare and temporary. It's been a consistent position. And it's made very clear that it's going to continue. So Kerry, for example, in his speech said that, among other indications, that Israel finally has that partner for peace that it's been desperately yearning for. He said not only the Arab states have said, yes, we want to normalize relations with you, but also the Palestinians are beginning to improve their behavior. And he mentioned one example. The Palestinians have accepted a military force, armed by the U.S., of course, trained by a general, a U.S. general, helped by the Jordanian dictatorship. And that military force has proven that that the Palestinian Authority can finally act responsibly. And he explained how it did that. During the Gaza attack, the U.S.-run security force was able to prevent any expression of sympathy for people in Gaza by the population of the West Bank. So they're doing their job. And that means they're beginning to act responsibly, and maybe we can admit them into the civilized world. He also said that, of course, Israel has to do some things too, not just the Palestinians and the Arabs. He said it has to freeze settlements. What does that mean? Well, all the settlements are criminal. Now, that's not even a question. In fact, Israel was informed by its highest legal authorities back in 1967 that any settlement in the occupied territories is in violation of the Geneva Conventions, the foundation of international humanitarian law. And they recognized it and said, well, yeah, that's what states do, so we're going to do it anyway. That was reiterated a couple of years ago by the World Court, including the U.S. Justice, in a separate declaration, said that, yes, the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories. So when you hear talk about Israel should remove its illegal outposts, that's meaningless. Every person there is there illegally. Every settlement is illegal. And when Kerry says you should freeze the settlements, he's saying continue the criminal activity that is breaking up the West Bank into unviable cantons and making impossible any meaningful Palestinian state. There's another aspect to freezing settlements. And I'm sure Kerry doesn't know, his analysts do. In fact, you can read about it in a new report of B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization that just came out a couple of days ago. One of the ways in which you freeze settlements is by expanding them. So put a ring around them, which takes in Palestinian land, often private land, and just keeping it, pushing it, I call it a security barrier, then you can do anything, and push it outward. And of course you have what's called natural growth. So maybe natural growth between a settlement turns into a city or something. So that's Kerry's recommendation for the U.S. and Israel.